Hi, and welcome back to my channel. I hope you've all recovered from last week's case where we talked about Mary Bell and how she became the youngest murderer in UK's history. Today's case is about John Emil List and how he went into hiding for years after murdering his family. The trigger warnings for today's case are mention of STD, murder, and also religious motive. So without any further ado, let's get on to the video. On September 17th in 1925, John Frederick List and Alma Marie Barbara Florence welcomed their son John Emil List to the world. The family lived in Michigan where John grew up as an only child in a very strict and religious household. His father was a very strict and very religious man who worked at the Sunday school. In 1901, John had managed to save up enough money to buy himself a 56-acre of farmland. At the time, he paid roughly around $900. But once the real estate industry started to arrive, the farm would end up being worth a good fortune. Now, just like I've mentioned, his father was described as a very, very hardworking, strict and also religious man, and he made sure to raise his son to be a devoted Lutheran. Now, John's father wasn't really a man who spoke or showed any kind of feelings, and his son would also grow up developing this pattern later on in his life. John was expected to excel in school and be a devoted Lutheran, but besides that, he shouldn't speak or be seen unless spoken to. Now, besides those roles, John didn't really pay that much attention into raising his son, so he left it to Alma to take care of him. And just as cold as John was, Alma was even more overprotective of her son. Now, John didn't really have that much friends growing up. Now, when the other neighbor kids would be outside playing, John would be inside the house with his mother Alma, who read the Bible to him. In 1943, John was in the US military, where he served as a laboratory technician. Now, Alma was against her son going into the military, but John defied his mother, maybe even for the very first time in his life. On the 30th of August 1944, John was informed that his father actually passed away, and at the funeral, he shed no tear and just didn't show any kind of emotion. So the pattern that John developed already starts to show. Now we'll skip time just a little bit. John was actually sent to Germany, where he was captured on the 11th of April in 1945. But the Germans soon realized that the war was lost, so they let John and his troops go. But as soon as he arrived, John, along with the other troopers, were on to the next war with Japan. And in April 1946, John returned back home to his mother. And he also went on to go to University of Michigan, where he earned his bachelor's degree in business administration, and he also got a master's degree in accounting. In 1950, John was recalled to the active military in Virginia as the Korean War started to escalate, and that's also where he met his soon wife-to-be Helen Morris. Helen was the widow of an infantry officer who was killed while being stationed in Korea, and she also had a 9-year-old daughter called Brenda. Before Helen's husband Marvin passed away, Helen and Brenda actually went to Korea to live with him, and whilst Marvin was living there, he had multiple affairs where he got several sexually transmitted diseases, and he did pass them on to Helen. She became so ill that she needed to be brought back to the United States in order for her to be able to recover. And it is said that Helen was not treated for syphilis that she got from Marvin, and she will suffer from this disease for the rest of her life. It's not known if Helen's STDs transferred over to John, but considering them having 3 children, it's probably very likely. When John and Helen started to date, Helen told John that she was pregnant with his child, and so almost 1 year later, on the 1st of December in 1951, John and Helen got married. John did have one condition, and that was that Helen needed to convert to the Lutheran Church. But shortly after the wedding, Helen came clean to John and told him that she wasn't actually pregnant. After John was discharged from the army in April of 1952, he decided to move back to Michigan, where his home was. John started to work for an accounting company in Detroit, and 2 years later, on the 8th of January in 1955, John and Helen welcomed their first daughter, Patricia Marie to the world. The family seemed to be very happy. Their marriage was good, and now they had this new baby to bring them even more joy. At the time, a new job opportunity will be presented to John. So the family packed up and moved to Kalamazoo, Michigan, where John would be working as a supervisor at a paper company. On the 21st of October in 1956, John and Helen would welcome their second child, John Frederick, to the world. It was important to John that his first son would be named after his late father, and he also made sure that his kids were raised just as religious as he was. But Helen, on the other side, wasn't very interested in going to church or reading the Bible to the kids, and that made John very, very angry. But again, he never showed his emotions. He would just get the kids ready and take them to service, leaving Helen behind. And they would constantly get into fights, or at least Helen would, because John didn't really argue back. He would just stay silent, but the resentment for Helen started to build more and more. But despite all of this, on the 26th of August in 1968, John and Helen welcomed the third child, Frederick Michael, to the world. This time around, though, Helen suffered from postpartum depression, and she will start to drink heavily on top of taking prescription drugs. And this resulted in her getting addicted to this combination, which she would never recover from. It quickly turned into a very serious problem. Whenever John would get back from work, Helen would be passed out on the couch with a scotch glass in her hand. Helen started to neglect everything. I mean, the kids weren't being fed, the diapers weren't being changed, and in general, Helen just stopped leaving the house more and more. And it would get even worse. Helen would start to call at John's work, leaving him messages, basically just calling him like a son of a, and saying if he wanted the diapers changed so badly, he should just do it himself. Her oldest daughter, Brenda, later on said that she could never forgive Marvin and that she basically just married John to not be alone. And for Brenda, this all became too much to handle. And as soon as she turned 18 years old, she married her boyfriend and moved out of the house. In 1959, John was fired from his workplace, and he kinda has a hard time keeping a job in general. His co-workers didn't seem to like him very much. John would constantly say something and act a certain way that would end up getting him fired. In 1965, John got a new job in New Jersey as a vice president and controller. So the family packed up and moved to New Jersey, and that's when Helen came across an old Victorian house. The house was underpriced due to its age and the fact that the house needed so many things repaired. John needed to borrow money from his mother Alma, who did have a small fortune due to her selling the land of her late husband, and Alma was just too happy to help her son out. But she did have one condition though, and that was that she wanted to live in the same house with John and his family. And while the idea of keeping the family close to you is actually a nice one, it led to a lot of problems. John and Helen agreed to the terms, and so Alma would move into the top floor apartment. Again, John enrolled his family into the local Lutheran church, and he, alongside his mother and children, were happy to be seen there. Only Helen didn't want to be a member of the church. John told her, I'm just guessing, that he took her off the list, but in reality, he never erased her name from the registry. Only 1 year after the family moved, John was fired yet again. His co-workers, alongside his boss, realized that John wasn't really a nice and kind man like he had portrayed himself to be. But this time, John just couldn't bring it over himself to tell his family that he had lost yet another job. So instead of just coming clean, John would act as if nothing was wrong. John would get up every morning and he pretended like he went to work, when in reality he drove to a train station where he would just sit around and read. And sometimes, if the weather was nice, he would even go for a longer walk, and at 5 p.m. he would just drive back home. And he kept this game up for 6 months. And since it was going downhill with Helen, John felt even more the need to prove his dominance, even more so with his kids. He would set up strict schedules for the children that he expected them to follow. John also had to approve of any friends that the kids had, and he also demanded to know where his kids were at any given time. And if any one of the kids dared to break the rule, John would just lash out on them. In 1967, John found work, but as the the cycle repeats himself, he was let go within a year. And to keep his face up, John would actually steal money from his mother's bank account. Alma at one point gave John the power of attorney, so it wasn't suspicious at all when he went to pick up the money. John was always in the mindset of he's going to pay it back to his mother eventually, but he soon realized that there was no more money for him to take. He had drowned that account. So Alma, who was in her late 70s by now, had no penny at that point. And on top of that, Helen was rushed to the hospital where she was diagnosed with general paralysis. Now, if I understood it correctly, general paralysis is a form of brain damage caused by untreated syphilis, which can result in partial paralysis. And the doctors recommended that Helen should be institutionalized in a hospital. But since they didn't have any money at this point, John didn't want to hear any of it. He just strictly refused. John did take another loan for $4,000, and he even took a second mortgage on the house for $7,000. But he still wasn't able to find a new job. And on top of that, Helen was now bedridden. Now, the two younger boys didn't quite get the seriousness of their mother's condition, but Patricia was older and she realized quickly that her mother was dying slowly. Patricia fell in love and discovered her passion for her school theater program that was run by a man called Ed Iliano, who was the teacher. Ed was in his early 40s and he was very passionate about the community theater. And he was amazed how Patricia seemed to have found direction for the first time in her life, how the drama group really affected her in a positive way. John, however, was furious when he discovered that his daughter was in acting class. He feared that if Patricia's newfound passion really led her into becoming an actress, that she would lose her way away from the church and also away from her Christian life. On the 5th of November in 1971, John called all three of his children to the kitchen table and calmly explained to them that they will die soon, and if they prefer to be buried or cremated. And whilst I'm doing my research and I came across it, I was just like, I can't even imagine what those kids must have felt like in that moment. To hear your father say, yep, you're going to die soon. Which way would you prefer to be, you want to be buried, you want to be cremated, what do you prefer? The kids in shock and terror just sat there and looked at their father until one of the boys said buried, and so the rest of them just followed. The same night, Patricia had rehearsal in her drama class, and Ed noticed that her eyes were red and swollen from crying, so he came up to her and asked if she was okay, and he offered her a ride back home. And in the car, she told him that her father was going to kill them all soon. And she told Ed that if John one day says she couldn't come to school for whatever reason because they were going away for a couple of weeks, that's how he was going to do it. Ed, now also in complete shock upon hearing this, tried to comfort Patricia as best as he could, and he told her that nothing bad would happen to her and that he would be there to protect her. In the early mornings of the 9th of November in 1971, John packed a briefcase along with a small suitcase and waited. Once the kids went out of the house to go to school, John went to a cabinet where he kept two pistols. One was from his father and the second one was his that he had brought home from the war. At around 8:30 a.m., the milkman made the weekly delivery, and as he was about to drop off the milk, he had found a note from John saying to stop all deliveries until further notice. In this note, it was explained that the family was scheduled to go on vacation. Helen came down shortly after the milkman had left to make herself some tea. As she was standing in the kitchen, John came up behind her with a pistol in his hand. Helen somehow sensed that someone was behind her, and as she turned around, John fired the gun, shooting Helen straight in her face. Helen immediately lost her life. John ran upstairs to his mother's room, where Alma was in the kitchen waiting for her toast to be finished. She asked John what this noise was, and he just shot her above her left eye. John took out a sleeping bag and put Helen and Elma's bodies in it. And as he was cleaning himself up, the amount of blood just overcame John so much that he actually threw up. Once he finished cleaning himself up, he put on a suit and a tie. John went back downstairs, where he cancelled an appointment for his home insurance company that was scheduled for the day. John told them that his mother-in-law was very ill and that his entire family is going to visit her. He then proceeded to write letters to the children's school saying they were students and that they would be out for a few days since they needed to make this emergency trip to North Carolina. John had some spare time, so he decided that he would go outside and do some garden work, kind of as the last time. And after he finished, he made himself a sandwich. And I'm just like, how? How are you able to eat right now? You just killed your wife and your own mother, and you're doing garden work and eating a sandwich. Later on the day, Patricia called her father to ask him if he could come pick her up because she wasn't feeling that well. John went and picked his daughter up, but as they arrived home, John just rushed to be the first one to get inside the house. And Patricia, not really thinking anything of it, took her time to get her books out from the back seats. She entered through the laundry room and she didn't see her father standing behind her. John also shot her in the back of her head and placed her body in the sleeping bag in the ballroom. At 1 p.m., John again cleaned himself up and changed his clothes. He then drove to a bank where he proceeded to cash a check for $85. After that, he went to the post office and mailed a letter to himself. This letter contained a key, and while he was at the post office, he also asked an employee to hold off on the family's mail for the next 30 days. After his visit to the post office, John went to the bank yet again, and at another window, he cashed a second check for $200. John then drove about 3 blocks further to the main office of the Suburban Trust Bank, where his mother Alma had her safety deposit box, which held saving bonds and jewelry. John cashed a total of $2,000, and he signed out of the vault at 1:57 p.m. After that, he made his way back home. Frederick arrived at 3 p.m. to his job he held after school, and he found out that Patricia had called in sick, so Frederick called his father to see what was going on. So John drove out to pick up his son because Frederick was concerned and told his employee that he just needed to get home. As with Patricia earlier, John made sure that he was the first one inside the house. Soon after, Frederick followed and John shot him directly in the head, immediately taking his life. And once again, John put the body of his son in the sleeping bag next to his sister and mother. Now on this day, his oldest son, John Frederick, was supposed to have soccer practice, but it was very cold on this day, so the practice got cancelled. So around 4 p.m., John Frederick was walking up the driveway, and that's when his father John started to panic. He tried to hide as fast as he could, but his son saw him and he also saw the gun. The bullet missed his head and hit him in the back. So John fired another shot to his son, but John Frederick was still alive. John was in such a rage that he emptied the whole gun out, and eventually John Frederick would also end up losing his life. He dragged his oldest son into the ballroom, placed him in a sleeping bag, and he actually put the bodies to be in the position of a cross. He then bent down, say a last prayer for his family. I personally think that it may be a little too late for praying at this point. John also called his pastor Ray Winkle and told him that his family were on their way to North Carolina and that he would be also flying there soon, and just told him that he wouldn't be able to teach Sunday school for at least a week. The pastor replied to John not to worry about it and that he would keep him and his family in his prayers. John also made a call to Patricia's Feeder workshop and told them the same story. He also wrote a letter to his mother-in-law, Ava Morris. Now, Ava was indeed very ill, and he wrote saying, "Miss Morris, by now I'm sure you heard what had happened to your daughter and the children. I'm very sorry that it had to happen, but I just couldn't see any other solution. I just couldn't support them anymore, and I didn't want them to go into poverty. Also, at this time, I knew that they were all Christians. I couldn't be sure of that in the future as the children grow up." Pastor Raymond Cole may add a few more thoughts. "With my sincere sympathy, John Emil List." He then wrote to Helen's sister, Jean Seifert, and said, "Miss Seifert, by now you have heard what happened to Helen and the children. I'm sorry that it had to go that way, but when I couldn't support them, I just couldn't let them go. Please accept my sincere sympathy, John. He also wrote to Alma's sister Lydia Meyer, where he said, Miss Meyer, by now you know what has happened to Mother and the rest of the family for a number of reasons. This was the only solution that I could see for the family and to save Mother. I felt it was best that she'd be relieved from the veil of tears. Please accept my sincere condolences. John would also write a letter to a man called Burton Goldstein, who had been selling insurance for his home. He wrote, Hello Bert, I'm sorry that it had to end this way, but with so little income, I just couldn't go on keeping the family together. And I didn't want them to experience poverty. I want to thank you for everything that you did for me. You treated me better than any associate I've ever dealt with. And I'm sorry that I have to repay you in this way. The files are marked so they can be turned over to you. Best wishes, John. John then took the letters and placed them in an unsealed envelope and addressed it to his pastor. And then there was only one more letter to write. John started the letter off by dating it November 9th, 1971, and he wrote, I'm very sorry to add this additional burden to your work. I know that what I have done is wrong from all that I have been taught, and that any reason I might give will not make it right. But you are the one person I know that, while not condoning this, will at least partially understand why I felt I had to do this one. I wasn't earning anywhere near enough to support us. Everything I tried seemed to fall to pieces. True, we could have gone bankrupt and maybe gone on welfare too, but it brings me to my next point. Knowing the type of location that one would have to live in, plus the environment for the children, plus the effect of them knowing they are on welfare, was just more than I thought that it could and should endure. I know that they were willing to have to cut back, but this involved a lot more than that. I was also fearful with Patrice being so determined to get into acting, what this might do to her continuing to be a Christian. I'm sure that it wouldn't have helped. Also with Helen not going to church, I knew that this would harm the children eventually and their attendance. I had continued to hope that she would begin to come to church soon, but she stated that she would want her name taken off the church roll. Again, this could only have given an adverse result for the children's continued attendance. So that is the sum of it. If any one of these had been the condition, we might have pulled through, but this was just too much. At least I'm certain that all have gone to heaven now. If things had gone on, who knows if that would have been the case. Of course, Mother got involved, because doing what I did to my family would have been a tremendous shock to her at this age. Therefore, knowing she is also a Christian, I felt it best that she'd be relieved of the troubles of this world that would have hit her after it was all over. I said some prayers for them all from the hymn book. That was the least I could do. Now for the final arrangements, Helen and the children have all agreed that they are preferred to be buried. Please see to it that the costs are kept low. For Mother, she has a plot at the Frankenmuth Church Cemetery. Please contact Mr. Herman Sellers. He is married to a niece of Mother and knows what arrangements are to be made. She always wanted Reverend Herman Sindler to preach the ceremony. I'm also leaving some letters in your care. Please send them on and add whatever comments you think are appropriate. The relations are as follows. Miss Lydia Meyer, Mother's sister. Miss Evan Morris, Helen's mother. Jean Seifert, Helen's sister. I will happen to the books and other personal things, but to the extent possible, I'd like for them to be distributed as you see fit. Some books might go to church or school library. Originally, I had planned this for the November 1st, All Saints' Day, but travel arrangements were delayed and I thought it would be an appropriate day for them to get to heaven. As for me, please let me be dropped off congregation roll. I leave myself in the hand of God's justice and mercy. I don't doubt that He's able to help us, but apparently He saw fit not to answer my prayers the way I hoped that they would be answered. This makes me think that perhaps it was for the best as far as the children's soul are concerned. I know that many will only look at the additional years they could have lived, but the family, they were no longer Christians. What would have been gained? Also, I'm sure many will say, how could anyone do such a horrible thing? My only answer is, it isn't easy and was only done after much thought. Miss Morrison may be reached at 802 Pleasant Hill Drive, Ecklenholm, of her sister. One more thing, I know know it may have been cowardly to always shoot from behind, but I didn't want any of them to know, even at the last second, that I had to do this for them. John got hurt more because he seemed to struggle longer. The rest were immediately put out of pain. Please remember me in your prayers. I will need them, whether or not the government does its duty as they say it fits. I'm only concerned with making my peace with God, and of this I am sure because of Christ is dying even for me. P.S. Mother's in the hallway in the attic third floor. She was too heavy to move. Later in the autopsy, it would come out that John had lied. Patricia was the only one who was shot from behind. The rest of the family saw in their last moments how John raised the gun. John put the confession letter in the envelope and he put the 2 pistols away. He taped a note to the envelope saying to Pastor Ray Winkle, Burton Goldstein and administers. And then he put a final note on the top of his desk addressed to whoever found it that the person should contact the authorities and that they would find an envelope in his desk which contained a key to another desk, and in this desk there were keys to the file. John would pray one more time, go back into the kitchen to make himself something to eat, and then he just went to sleep. Well, he just casually has the corpses of his entire family laying around in the house. The first thing he comes up with after writing those confession notes is just to make himself something to eat. Again, how is he able to eat, let alone sleep, in the same house that his whole family is just laying there dead? The next morning when John woke up, he got himself dressed, turned the thermostat down to 50 degrees in order for the decomposition to be slowed down. He turned off all the lights in the house except the one in the ballroom where the bodies were. And then he turned the music on, playing classic music very, very loudly. And after that, John took his briefcase and suitcase. He took the $2,500, drove to the workplace where Patricia and Frederick worked after school, where he left a letter explaining their absence. And then he drove to the airport. Once he parked his car, he turned it off and put the keys under the front seat. Weeks passed and Patricia's theater teacher, Ed, would drive to their house because he still remembered the concern that Patricia voiced to him about her father hurting her. Now, Ed actually had a friend who was working in the police department. So he told his friend what was going on, but this officer told Ed that they just couldn't go inside this house. So then Ed called John's church, but the pastor assured him that there was nothing to worry about. And on the 5th of December, Ed decided that he needed to take a look for himself. He had a feeling that something was very, very off, so he drove to the List's house. He pushed open a window and crawled inside the house where he could hear music playing, and that's when he saw that the lights were on in the ballroom. As he was entering the ballroom, he was faced with the gruesome truth laying there. Ed was terrified and ran out of this house, and for the next 2 days he wouldn't tell anyone what he saw. Ed did say that at first he was scared to come forward because he thought he could get into trouble for trespassing. On the 7th of December, Ed returned to the List's house because earlier that day he overheard some boys of the drama class saying that they would go there themselves to check it out. So Ed confronted the boys and told them not to worry and that he would take a look. And his assistant Barbara decided to just, come along with him. So the two of them drove over there, and Ed tried to make as much of a commotion as he could so he could get the neighbors' attention. And a friend of Alma, whose name is Shirley, recognized Ed's car because he drove around the neighborhood a few times by now. She decided to call the police, and she would also tell her husband William, who happened to be a doctor, to go over there and, take a look on what was going on. After just a few minutes, the police arrived, and after a quick explanation, they did decide to check it out. They were immediately greeted with a strong smell and loud music playing. Ed led the officers to the ballroom where they discovered really badly decomposed bodies. The police chief was called and the bodies were being identified, and as they continued to search the house, a scream was suddenly heard from the upstairs room. Alma's body was also found by now. The police also found the letter and called Pastor Raymond, who was shocked to read the confession letter from John, whose car by now was also found at the airport. And with his passport missing, the police suspected that he might have fled the country. On the 10th of December in 1971, Helen, Patricia, John and Frederick were laid to rest. Well, in the meantime, the FBI was trying their hardest to work on this case to find John. There were posters and flyers all over the country with John's face and what he had done, but the truth was they had no clues on where he could be. After all, he did have 1 month's head start. And where was John, you ask? Well, he was heading in Denver. After getting out of New York, he bought himself a mobile home and now went under the name of Robert P. Clark. And in 1972, he found himself work as a cook again. This time, he made a really good impression to his co-workers and his boss. So much so that in 1974, his boss got a better job opportunity and he took John with him. He started to make a new life and even enrolled in a new church, the St. Paul's Lutheran Church. And by the time of 1976, he even got a new driver's license under his new name. So Robert P. Clark fully came to life. John even met a woman by the name of Dolores Miller. They met at the local single sponsored by the Lutheran Church. Dolores was in her mid-30s and she was described as a very, very shy but also very religious woman. And she was also recently divorced. So they get to know each other and John was very, very sweet, caring, the whole shebang. He even told Dolores that he was also married once, but that his wife passed away due to cancer. And Dolores never really pressured John to talk about his past. 1 year later, John even managed to get hired as an accountant again. And he and Dolores moved in together. By the time in 1985, Dolores, who at first wasn't really interested in getting married again, said yes to John. And so they got married on the 23rd of November in 1985. And their wedding was just 20 miles away from where John and Helen got married. Only 5 months after getting married, John was fired from his job. And so once again, he started to look for another accounting job. In February of 1987, a friend of John and Dolores stumbled upon an article where a mass murderer was described who killed his entire family in 1971 and was still on the loose, and this article also had a picture of John Emil List, and the similarities were just shocking to say the least. So Wanda went over to Dolores to show her what she had just discovered, but Dolores downplayed it, saying that this just couldn't be her John. Wanda asked Dolores to at least show it to to John, but when later asked, Doris admitted that she threw the paper away to not upset her husband. In November of the same year, John and Dolores moved away because John had found himself a new job in Richmond, Virginia. Around 1988, Fox Broadcasting had started to air a new program called America's Most Wanted, which was hosted by John Walsh. The program was about criminals who were still not convicted for the crimes, with pictures of how they looked or could look right now. It also encouraged people, if they had any tips, to call them. The FBI agent who was working on the John List case was determined to get the case on the program, but the producers were at first against it because the case was too cold to be featured. But this FBI agent didn't take no for an answer. So about 9 months later, he flew to speak to the head producer Michael Linda. He explained the whole case to him, and Michael agreed to air an episode about John. The only problem was that they had no idea how John looked right now. So Michael phoned up a man called Frank Bender, who was an artist in Philadelphia and happened to work with the police on the faces of the victims who were unidentifiable occasionally. He created a profile to how he thought John List would look like today. And on the 21st of May in 1989, the episode aired, capturing almost 22 million viewers. One of the viewers would be Wanda, the previous neighbor from Dolores, and as soon as she saw that episode, she knew that she was right all along and noted the number from the tip line. Her son Randy called and told him about this new name that John had taken on and the current address. Not even 1 day later, this information had reached the FBI agent and brought him straight to Richmond, Virginia. On the 1st of June, the agents went knocking on the door, only to find Dolores there. John was currently working, and they asked if they could come inside the house. The agents explained to Dolores that they were here because of the show America's Most Wanted, and even showed her a flyer with the picture of John, and by the look on Dolores' face, they were sure that they had finally found him. The lawyers showed him a current photo from the wedding day, and all doubts were wiped. One agent stayed behind with the lawyers while the other agents went straight to John's working place. They asked him to confirm his identity and also asked him a few questions, but still John denied being John List. It wasn't until he was brought to the police station to give up his fingerprints, and after hours of comparison, they finally had their match. After almost 18 years on the run, John Emil List was finally arrested for the murders of his mother, his wife, and his 3 children. And once it got out, the press went just wild. The lawyers even wrote a statement stating basically for the people to respect your privacy, because she now had to comprehend what was going on as well. For her, this wasn't the man she knew and loved. John was never aggressive towards her, and finding out what he did, her whole world just came crashing down on her. But despite all the evidence, John still claimed to be Robert P. Clark, and so he pledged not guilty, and his bond was set to $1 million. And on the 10th of November in 1989, John was brought back to New Jersey, where he would await trial. And on the 12th of April in 1990, the jury found John List guilty of first-degree murder. But since at the time of the murder there wasn't a capital punishment, John was actually spared the death sentence. On the 1st of May 1990, John List was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. So that means he would never be eligible for parole, and he would be in jail for the rest of his life. John Emil List died on the 21st of March in 2008 due to a lung infection. So that was today's case. I hope you all enjoyed it, and if so, please don't forget to subscribe and leave me a like and a comment on which case you would like to see me cover next. I hope I see you all next week. Bye!